Welcome back to our Surrey Virtual School podcast, and thank you for joining us. As you all know, the virtual schools champion the education of children and young people in care, previously in care, and children with a social worker. Today, we'll be talking all things related to children with a social worker. I'm Imran, and I'm a data quality officer with the Surrey Virtual School team. We also have Michelle Cain, who's our deputy head teacher for children with a social worker, and Martha Keogh, who's our specialist educational psychologist for children with a social worker. So you're both new to the virtual school in Surrey. Tell us a bit about yourselves.
Hi, well, I'm Michelle, and I'm new to Surrey for the last, maybe 2 months. But I have worked in virtual schools for the last 10 years. I previously worked for Hampshire Virtual School, but I'm a teacher by trade, and secondary and sixth form, and then came into local authority work doing school improvement. Was seconded into a virtual school and ended up staying and I'm really thrilled to continue being in a virtual school, but in a different local authority.
And I'm Martha, and as you said, I'm a specialist educational psychologist for children with a social worker. Very recently joined the Surrey Virtual School, but previously I have worked in the Southwest Educational Psychology team. So some people listening to this may know my name through that, either being in their school, doing schoolwork, or through training.
Can you tell us a bit more about these new duties?
Well, Imran, it's quite a big brief that we have, because it's any child who has or has ever had a social worker. And when we're using the term children with a social worker, this covers all children who were assessed as needing a social worker at any time due to safeguarding or welfare reasons. And that includes all those subject to a child in need, so a SIN plan or a child protection CP plan. And it actually includes children from 0 up to 18 in all educational settings. We're really excited to have this brief, though. I think that virtual school is really well placed to be able to raise the profile of this cohort, but it is, as you can tell, a big, wide-ranging brief.
In terms of who these children are, we have a wonderful data manager called Liz, and she's been exploring our data set to identify all these children and young people. So we currently know that we have around 2,233 children of statutory school age who have an active children's social care record. Of those 2,233 children, 1,586 children are subject to children in need plans, and 647 are subject to child protection plans. A high proportion of those children are also young carers, so around 32% of those are young carers. And there's a high proportion as well with education, health and care plans, so that's around 41%, and 20% are at SEN support level. So we know these children and young people have a high level of need within education as well.
And I think, Martha, it'd be fair to say that it's been quite a journey, hasn't it, looking at this data? And I think it just continually is changing as well. We're talking to lots of other virtual schools nationally and comparing data, and it really is providing us with a bit of a mandate for where we go and what we do as well, isn't it?
And Liz is still looking at the post-16 data and the early years data as well to try and identify those children and young people with a social worker.
But yeah, in terms of these new duties and us coming to the virtual school and the role, the duties talk about the school head being able to demonstrate the benefits of attending an education setting, and it talks a lot throughout the duties about education being a protective factor. And I think that's something that perhaps, having done virtual school work for many years now, it's kind of obvious that when a child is in school they are safe, and that school provides a protective factor for these children and young people. And what the virtual school head and what this team is here to do is to try and demonstrate the benefits of actually attending education setting. And a lot of the meetings that we've been going to nationally and locally, and the conversations also we've been having with Surrey schools, is how do we crack attendance, isn't it, Martha, around children with a social worker and engaging those hard to reach parents. So that's going to be something that we are hoping to kind of work with schools and other services to focus on. But as well as that, trying to ensure that there are mechanisms in place to offer advice and support to teachers and to social workers, with the ultimate aim of narrowing the gap in attainment. With the impact of COVID, it's affected all children, and for many, the most vulnerable, it has been quite a magnified effect, and it has just increased the barriers to education. But I suppose before that, the barriers to engagement with education, which goes back to what we were saying about attendance. So it really is essential that the cohort of children with a social worker are supported to recover from the pandemic, and the duties talk about how we'll be working with schools to ensure that they utilise the recovery premium and the national tutoring programme as best they can.
Why do you think the virtual school are the service that are promoting the duties?
I think that the reason the virtual school have been chosen, I mean, we've had the corporate parenting duties for children in care for many years now, and have really developed ways of working with schools and across services to try and improve outcomes for that cohort. And then a few years ago, we added the previously looked after cohort in terms of offering advice and guidance to schools to try and support those. And so I think virtual schools have had a journey of developing knowledge and understanding and experience. And I think working with schools and talking to other partners across local authorities, we've known that children with a social worker, children on the edge of care, are just as vulnerable as the other cohorts that we've been working with. I mean, previously looked after children are experiencing permanency for the first time. Children in care have corporate parenting to try and ensure that there is provision in place and that we're supporting education. And children with a social worker haven't yet had that focus. And I think the pandemic has magnified that. So I think the virtual school is really well placed to use our knowledge and expertise from those cohorts. So virtual school heads are very much a strategic leader to champion the education attendance, the attainment, and ultimately the progress of children with a social worker. So essentially what that means is that we're helping to kind of make visible all the disadvantages that children with a social worker experience, and the guidance will tell us there's no one factor that is a barrier to engagement, but it's sort of a collective range of difficulties and issues. And so what we're doing strategically is trying to enhance the partnerships between education settings, local authorities, and help all agencies hold sort of high aspirations for children with a social worker. Part of that is about promoting practice that supports children's engagement in education. Sort of recognising, again, I come back to attendance, it's a golden thread running through a lot of what we're trying to achieve at the moment, but that recognising attendance at an education setting is one of the most important factors of keeping children safe from harm. And ultimately, the virtual school is there to level up children's outcomes in terms of narrowing the gap so that every child with a social worker can try to reach their potential and recover from the impact of the pandemic.
Okay, so there's a lot in trying to make this group more visible and make sure that education is a protective factor. So what are you going to be doing to support children with a social worker in Surrey, and what's coming up next?
So myself and Anne Winfoy, who's the virtual school head teacher, have visited a number of mainstream schools with some of the highest numbers of children with a social worker within Surrey to explore their experiences of meeting the needs of this cohort and to identify some of the enablers and barriers to accessing education and support. We are using this information to plan some of our next steps to ensure we're providing support that schools need. There were lots of areas of good practice mentioned which we want to share, for example, ways schools are engaging hard to reach families, and some points for improvement and development, for example, when engaging with social care, which we want to take forward. Using the themes identified during the school meetings, we're also creating a bank of resources and key documents for schools, which will be shared via Padlet. We are hoping that this will be shared shortly, so keep your eye out. And we're also going to be sharing this information with senior leaders within Surrey to raise awareness of the new duties, the visibility of this group, and the key areas for development that were raised by schools.
Oh, and we're also going to be doing the training, of course. So we're going to put together a bit of a training offer that will be advertised shortly, starting next academic year. And hopefully we're going to be able to invite our designated teachers, of course, but also widen it to our DSLs, because a lot of the conversations that we've been having with schools have been with DSLs, because obviously they have they have the remit around children with a social worker. However, being new to Surrey, as I am, I'm trying to talk to lots of people across the county and in schools to think about all the different training offers that are already in place, especially around key themes like attachment and trauma, because we have lots of different providers and we have lots that have already been done. So we're trying to think about what's been done in the past, what's on offer in the future, and look at services internally and externally as well. And we're really keen to have a joined up approach to training. Part of that, we are really hoping to seek out and invite some enthusiastic schools to work with us for various pilot projects. We want to kind of establish what works well for children with a social worker in Surrey. Some of the key themes that are coming out, as I've already mentioned, are things like attendance and hard to reach parents, but we're keen to work with schools as well to think about developing resources that can be useful, go-to information packs or strategies that could be used in classroom or with parents, working with social workers, and especially working with our schools to think about how do we identify the needs of children with a social worker, understand them, and then plan to meet them. And leading on from that, what's really interesting to us is the SIN and CP plans as they stand. Again, we've been talking to virtual schools nationally about this, and we're really keen to explore to what extent is education actually focused on during early help, during SIN and CP planning, and see what level we can promote education at within those early stages, because we know it is such an important protective factor for children with a social worker. So we want to work with our social care colleagues as well as DSLs in schools to explore those plans. Really keen to work with as many schools as possible and to think about some pilot projects. But alongside that, in terms of what we're trying to do, Imran, to come back to your question, is as a virtual school, we have to be involved nationally and with our Southeast regional groups to share good practice, and we're trying to build up an evidence base really of what works and feed that back to the DFE, and all Liz's work on data that will kind of look at the impact will help us with that reporting. So quite a bit to do and lots of plans.
So what can our schools do to support children with a social worker?
Well, one of our key targets is to make this cohort visible. So we'd like schools to try and identify these children and young people. We would like schools to monitor their attendance and progress and start to develop their own data set around these children. As we know, these children are safer when they're in school. And another factor we are working on as well is engaging hard to reach families. So for schools to be building those relationships with children and families and those hard to reach parents. We know schools are using a lot of creative methods to build those relationships with these families, and this will be an ongoing area of focus for us as well.
We're really keen to make sure that we're working with the right groups of colleagues in schools. So obviously we're very familiar with working with our DTs, and it's very often that the DT is also the DSL, but that's not the case necessarily. So just making sure that that schools are reflecting on their current co-working. So if you're already the DT and the DSL, that's quite a lot. So you might like to think about who else can support you with this extended remit in school. But if you're the DT and not the DSL, how you are beginning to connect and work to think about developing the data set around these children and young people and getting the visibility across your setting. We're going to be working hard to connect more with DSLs in the future. So historically, we've been very DT facing. We're keen to kind of build relationships with DSLs in schools as well. Schools also need to be thinking about maximising the use of recovery premium and ensuring that children with a social worker are prioritised for the national tutoring programme. Both of those things are very clearly stated in the extended duties as well, which is probably worth referring to. And I guess what we're asking is for schools to start thinking a bit more about what can be done to support children with a social worker, and to keep communication lines open with us so that we can work collaboratively on identifying what does work.
So schools want to start thinking a little bit more about what they're going to do to support children with a social worker. They may also want to take a little look at the document that's called What Works in Education for Children Who Have Had Social Workers by the Education Endowment Fund, and that explores the evidence base behind particular interventions for children with a social worker or have ever had a social worker.
And give us a follow on Twitter, of course. We will be keeping up to date on there with the training offer that's coming up. We have the newsletter that comes out, and we're updating our website as well to have a section on there for children with a social worker. So watch those spaces.
And that sadly brings us to the end of our second podcast. I want to thank Michelle and Martha for taking the time out to join us today and for sharing so much useful information.
Thanks for having us, Imran.
Yeah, thanks, Imran. It's been really good to talk through. I think these new duties are really exciting, and we are looking forward to getting out into schools and working together.
That's it from us. If you have any questions about what's been discussed in today's podcast, please don't hesitate to get in touch with us at the virtual school, and we'll be sure to help you however we can. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you at the next